Okay, so we're going to look at those two passages that Joan read for us, and we're kind of completing our little series where we've looked at what it means to follow Jesus. And this morning we're going to be looking at how following Jesus should leave a legacy. There should be something that we do which steps into the future. That's what we're going to be thinking about. And to get us thinking about that to start with, I want to talk to you about a company called Alcor from Scottsdale, Arizona. And this company describes itself as the world leader in cryonics. For those of you who have no idea what that means, this is how the company's website describes who they are and what they do. So cryonics is the practice of preserving life, in their words, by pausing the dying process and using sub-freezing temperatures with the intent of restoring good health with medical technology in the future. So they have, as it says there, 234 active clients who are presently stored in vitrified states where their blood has been removed. They've been replaced with a substance which is supposed to protect the body's vital organs, and they're now stored at a temperature of minus 196 degrees centigrade. This company would say about these people that they are alive, that they have just paused the dying process, and that one day they're going to restore these people to life once again. The hope is that one day medical science will get to a point where they'll be able to cure whatever led to this person being where they are, revive them, and they'll be able to live a brand new life. The company describes their work as being an ambulance to the future. So depending on your view, what you have there in Arizona is 234 people who are not moving, not eating, not talking, unconsciously waiting for a life that they hope to have, one which they hope is going to be better than the one they previously living. And as we begin this morning, I'd like us to consider something. Is that a good metaphor for how some people live as Christians? Where they believe in Jesus. Is it even a good metaphor for churches, where people believe in Jesus, they have hopes for the future, and are right now just waiting for heaven, waiting for something better to begin, and are not, in a spiritual sense, very active at all. Maybe not active at all in any way. I think it's a good question. It's a good question to think about as we complete this little series, thinking about what it means to follow Jesus and how whether following Jesus does actually make a difference to our lives. If none of what I've just said in that little sentence rings any bells for you, over the last 3 weeks we've looked at what it means to follow Jesus, and we've thought about how we all follow someone or something. We all have influences which guide us and direct us and cause us to go in certain directions. We all have things that influence our thinking about our money, what we do with our body, and so on. That was where we were in the first week. That was designed to get us thinking, okay, what am I actually following? And then over the last 2 weeks, we've thought about, okay, what difference should following Jesus make to my life? What difference should following Jesus make to my emotions? And then this week, the question we're going to be thinking about is this one. What is the legacy that I'm laying down for the future? In terms of my following Jesus, what legacy am I leaving for the future? What difference does me being a Christian make to my family? What difference does it make to others? What difference does it make to my children, my friends, my co-workers, my neighbors? What difference does me being a Christian make to anyone? And we're going to ask ourselves a really, really uncomfortable question. And it's this one. Have we spiritually slipped into a bit of a cryogenic process where no one would know we were a Christian apart from the fact we go to church, because what we do doesn't look like we do very much at all? Are we people who've got hopes for the future, but we're kind of like in a spiritual ambulance waiting for our real life to begin? That if there was a scale where at one end you had Frozen and at the other end you had spiritually alive, where would you be? And we're going to explore that by looking at 3 different questions. We're going to explore how we're following Jesus by thinking about what we pray, what we say, and whether we stay. And I've only picked those 3 things because they rhyme. What we pray, what we say, and whether we stay. Now, when you read the Bible, it can become really clear really quickly that following Jesus was never meant to be a personal, private thing. It's really, really, really obvious. You couldn't be a follower of Jesus and keep it under the radar. So the Apostle Paul would write things like this: always be ready to give an answer for the hope that you have. Always be ready to share what you think about Jesus with other people. There's no way of reading things like that and come up with a faith that says, I just keep this to myself and I don't share this with anyone. Our lives should provoke questions. We should at times be confusing to people because they don't get why we do what we do and why we say what we say. And that should be in a good way, not necessarily in a bad way. Jesus said to his followers, when he called them, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. Follow me and following me is going to make a difference not only to you, but to the people that you encounter. He said things like, if someone takes advantage of you and makes you go 1 mile, go 2 with them. Do something which really confuses them. And one of the readings today says this to us: go and make disciples of all nations. Go make disciples of all nations. You can't read any of these verses and come to the conclusion that being a Christian is like being a stealth bomber, where no one knows you're there and you're just flying up there, but radar never detects you. It's much more like the red arrows. Everyone sees the red arrows. When they're flying about and they're doing the jets behind them, you can't mistake that they're there. And the question for us is, am I a stealth bomber or am I one of the red arrows in terms of my Christianity? And so, we're going to look at those 3 things. And the first one is, what do you pray? What do you pray? And specifically, what do you pray about people who are not part of us right now? Do you pray for those kinds of people? When we look at the life of Jesus, we can see that his heart was inclined towards people who weren't following him, that his emotions were involved, that he cared deeply about them. So on the day he enters Jerusalem, and everyone is crying Hosanna, and everyone is saying praise him, he says these words whilst he's weeping: if only you knew what would bring you peace, but now it's hidden from you. He weeps over people that don't get who he is. And this is something he's always felt. All through his ministry, he cares deeply about people. So when Joan read earlier, she read those words from Matthew chapter 9, where he's been healing people and he's been teaching people, and he sees the crowds flocking towards him. And he looks at them, and he looks at his disciples, and he says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send workers out into his harvest field. Let's just pause there and look at what Jesus says. He's saying to his disciples in those words, there are more opportunities out there than you realize. There are more people who will respond to the good news than there are workers who are prepared to go out and take that good news to them. Or to put it another way, the harvest is greater than the number of workers. And so then he says, if that's true, therefore we should pray. We should pray. Different versions of the Bible put another word in there to draw out the nuance of what Jesus says, and put it like this: pray earnestly. Pray earnestly to the Lord. Beg, plead, keep on praying that God will work and God will move, that God will raise up people to bring in this incredible harvest. And it should be enough to say that was Jesus' heart, and that should be enough for us. But if we look elsewhere in the New Testament, we see this same passion for people who aren't part of the church to be brought into the church. So when the Apostle Paul writes to his protege Timothy, he says these words, that we should pray for kings and all in authority so that we might live quiet and peaceful lives. And we might think that that's just so we can live a quiet and peaceful life. But it gets towards the end and we see the real reason why he wants this to happen. Because God desires all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. He wants us to pray for rulers so that people will find out who Jesus is. If following Jesus should make a difference to our lives, and it should, and if we should be becoming more like him, then these are the kind of things that we should pray. Our emotions should mirror his. Our passions should mirror his. So here's a good question for us, a bit of a spiritual temperature check. Ask yourself this question. Who am I praying for regularly and passionately to become a follower of Jesus? Who am I praying for? Who am I praying for regularly and passionately to become a follower of Jesus? Who do I see as his harvest? Where are my prayers setting up a legacy for the future? So just think about your life for a moment. If at this moment you're thinking, I don't really pray for anyone, think about your life and ask yourself another question. Who would you love to become a follower of Jesus? Who would you love to get who he is? Start praying for them. Start praying for them earnestly that God will bring them into his family. If you're a parent or a grandparent, pray for the kids. Pray passionately that they won't just know about Jesus, but they'll know him. Pray for the kids who go out to junior church, that they will be better than us. Pray about the empty seats in this room and ask that God will fill them. Next week, we have a holiday club for the children of the town. Here's a question. Is it going to feature in your prayers this week? Is it going to feature? Because it should. And so at this point, I'd just like to ask you to use what we've thought about so far as a little diagnostic tool. Does this kind of prayer regularly feature in your life? If there was a cold and a hot kind of scale, where would you put yourself? I'm not going to ask you to tell me, just keep that to yourself. Does your prayers land more in the area of, give me what I want, God, or may your kingdom come, God? If your prayers are more, make things peaceful for me, give me a good night's sleep, I'm going to suggest something a little bit provocative. Maybe you're a little bit cryogenic and you need to warm up a bit. So, what legacy are your prayers building? What do they reveal? Keep that and hold it, and we'll add something on else now. Keep it in mind as an idea for where you currently are. So earlier on, I mentioned that being a Christian is not a solo enterprise, but it's a life where we're supposed to build one another up. When you look at the Bible, it's not about you doing things on your own. It's about helping others to see who Jesus is. So this is where Joan's second reading now kicks in. Some of the most famous words ever spoken in the Bible by Jesus to his disciples just before he returns to heaven. He says these words, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you." Now, my question for you as I look at this passage is this. What's the key command in those verses? What's the most important thing that Jesus says there? Now, I grew up for years listening to people who would say, go places, go somewhere, go to the other side of the world and tell them about Jesus. Share your faith with the people in the place where God tells you to go. And there's a lot of good in that, but you could end up with thinking, well, God hasn't told me where to go yet. God hasn't told me the place he wants me to go. So I'll just park the sharing Jesus bit until he tells me where I am supposed to go. I'll bumble along, and this bit is really for the deeply committed people who God tells to go somewhere. Here's the thing, though. That focus on go isn't right. The big command in that bit of the Bible is actually make disciples. Make disciples. The go bit has got more of a sense of having gone, so wherever you go, make disciples. And then it tells us what making a disciple looks like. It says, baptize them and teach them to obey everything I've commanded you. So break that down. Break that down for a moment. You share the gospel with someone and they pray a prayer of commitment. Have you made a disciple? Yes. And no. And no. Someone goes down into the pool here and they tell us all about their life. They tell about the difference Jesus has made to them and they get baptized. Have we made a disciple when we've baptized someone? Yes. And no. There used to be a board game which we used to play in my house, which for the life of me, I can't remember what it is. But it had this slogan on the side, which is stuck in my brain. A moment to learn, a lifetime to master. If anyone knows what that board game is, it's been bugging me all week. Just tell me afterwards. A moment to learn, a lifetime to master. Jesus tells his people, make disciples. And a disciple is someone who obeys everything that he's commanded. That's a lifelong thing. It's a lifelong thing. And it's not just Jesus who talks like this. When the Apostle Paul wrote to the Galatian church, he poured out his hopes and his dreams for them. And when they were going off track and they were getting things wrong, he said these words, that his passion for them to become who they were supposed to be felt like childbirth until Christ was formed in them. Did he write the words, I'm in the pains of childbirth until you're emotionally moved by a message and you lift your hand in response? He didn't write that. Did he write, I'm in the pains of childbirth until the baptismal pool is opened and we see someone go through the waters? No. He wrote, my life feels like labor pains until I see that you have become like Jesus Christ. Until you have become like Jesus. That's making a disciple. It's not a one-off moment. It's a life-on-life ongoing thing. You know, in the Gospels, when Jesus says the words, there is more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than 99 people who feel they don't need to, I'm not convinced that's just about conversion. I think it's an ongoing thing. I have this sneaky suspicion that the angels in heaven, every time they see a believer get something and say, oh, I've been an idiot for so long, I need to turn away from that, that they're high-fiving each other with their wingtips or whatever they do because they've seen someone become a little bit more like Jesus. I think that's what it's more like. So when we reflect on what we say, the question now becomes, the question that Jesus lays before us is this one. Who am I making a disciple of? Do I want to see people mature in their faith? Who are the people I teach to obey everything that Jesus has commanded? And that's where we have to realize that the word teach covers an awful lot of ground. Because some of us might be thinking, well, if Jesus is saying I've got to teach people things, I'm not very good at teaching. I'm never going to lead a Bible study. That might be what you're thinking. And for some of you, that might be true, and some of you it might not be. But that's not the only way we teach, is it? Sometimes teaching someone to be a disciple means you get alongside them and you talk to them and you listen to what they're saying about their life, and you let your faith set the agenda of where the conversation goes. So when they talk to you in a self-absorbed way, you challenge it. When their choices are leading them away from Jesus and not towards him, you bring them back on track. Sometimes making a disciple is weeping with those who weep. Sometimes it's encouraging those who need to be encouraged. Sometimes it's telling the bereaved who've lost a loved one where their where their beloved one is. That's what I had to do with Flavia this week. Tell her where Dan is. Sometimes teaching is being an example to people about how they should live. So your life can teach others about why you forgive, why you don't hold a grudge. Teaching people means you're involved with them. Eleanor Roosevelt once said these words, "Many people will walk in and out of your life, but only true friends will leave footprints in your heart." If you Google the term levels of friendship, you can get anything from 4 to 7 and 111 different levels of friendship. Some people really, really think about this sort of stuff. But here are some levels of friendship that are common. Acquaintances, where you don't really know people very well at all. You might meet them frequently enough that they aren't strangers to you. You might know where they live, you might know what their children's names are, what they do as a job, but you don't really know them and you don't influence them. In terms of the welcome mat, they would probably get the welcome-ish one. Then you have casual friends, people that you socialise with, maybe see at parties, you have conversations with that go a little bit deeper. So you'll ask them about work and how their kids are doing, but it won't go to any depths. And you'll just talk about the positive areas of life. So they won't bare their soul to you and you won't bare your soul to them. But below that, you have deep friendships where you know that person, you know something of their struggles. You know that you can go to that person and say, this is where I am right now. And it's dark and it's confusing. This is where I failed Jesus. And they can do the same with you. And it's in those relationships where discipleship happens. That's where you build people up. And so perhaps another good question to take away and think about is this one. On whose hearts do I want to leave footprints that help them become more like Christ? Whose heart do you want to leave footprints on today? Who do you want to make a difference to? I think in a post-COVID world, another good question is this one. Who are the people I would be inconvenienced for? Who are the people I would be inconvenienced for if my inconvenience led them to become more like Christ? If we go back to the people in the tubes where we started this morning, a challenge that comes from this is, if we aren't taking what Jesus says about making disciples and what Paul says about making disciples seriously, maybe we're colder than we should be. And then, after these two, there's the last thing for us to think about. The thing which I put in just because it rhymed, which was whether you stay. And now, I picked that admittedly because it rhymed. That's how my brain works. Me saying whether you stay doesn't mean that you can't move or that you can't move churches or anything like that. It's about, in your life, have you made a commitment where you've drawn a line in the sand and you're saying, my life and my choices fit here. There's a line that I won't go past. I'm going to be shaped by Jesus and he's going to make a difference to me. In history, there was a man called Martin Luther who, a few hundred years ago, rediscovered one of the fundamental parts of the Christian faith, that we're saved by faith and not by works. He was placed on trial and he was told, hey, just recant everything, say you were wrong, and that'll be the end of it. And he gave this speech where he said he would do no such thing. And in his writings, he says these words, "Here I stand, I can do no other." He had made a commitment that he was not going to deviate from. A bit like Joshua at the end of his story when he gathers the people together and says, serve who you want, but as for me, I'm going to serve the Lord. He chooses to stay. He chooses to stick to his commitment. And that's something that I think as life goes on, we need to evaluate whether we still do that. The American pastor John Piper once delivered a message which stuck in the minds of people who heard it. He talked about people who he watched who retired. Now, this is not me having a go at anyone who's retired. And he said that when they retired from work, they retired, period. They retired from everything. They would give up their work in church. He described them as being only interested from that point forwards in walking on the beach and collecting shells. Now, I quite like collecting junk from the beach, so if you like doing that, don't feel deeply challenged by that. But the big point he's making is this, and this isn't just for retired people to hear. He's saying, don't lose your passion. Don't check out. Were you more committed to praying and making disciples in the past than you are now? If you can see that you were, maybe try and get back there. And yet, there's going to be different seasons where the shape of things changes. When you have kids or when you have less energy, and for me, those two things go together. But there should never be a season in your life where you have completely checked out from praying or trying to make disciples. Maybe at some stages of life, you might say, but all I can do is pray. Brilliant. That's probably the most important bit, actually. Keep doing it. We should always be seeking to pray earnestly for others. We should always be thinking, how can I build discipleship into someone else's life? We should always be thinking, what legacy am I going to leave? So if you can look back and say, you know what, I used to be more passionate than I am now, maybe it's a moment to reevaluate. And that's where we draw all of this together. With that question once again, what legacy is the life I am living today leaving behind? Not necessarily the life I used to live, but what legacy is the life you're living today leaving behind? Is your prayer life as much about a harvest for God as it is for your needs? Is your life one where you're seeing in some way that you're helping others to become more like Christ? Is your Christianness more red arrows or more stealth bomber? These are all good questions for us to think about. Is your faith right now more like the people who signed up for the cryogenic lab? Or is it more living and breathing? Are you someone who's just waiting for God to take you to the future? And if any of those things resonated, or if any of those things challenged, and you're thinking, I need to warm myself up a bit, firstly, that's good. It means God's at work in you and you aren't frozen. You aren't really dead. That's a good thing. So here are some steps on how you might warm yourself up. Some of the questions we thought about earlier. Who do you really want to see become more like Jesus? Who do you really want to see become more like Jesus? Pray for them. Whose heart do you want to leave footprints on? Get to know them. Who do you pray for regularly? Plead for them. And the big one, the most important one for warming yourself back up, see what Jesus did for you. Because actually all the other ones can just be done out of guilt. The big one is see what Jesus did for you. Because all of these things should be based on what he has done for us. He prays actually for you now. Jesus prays for you. That's an amazing thought. He gave his Spirit to make you like him. He stood his ground for you, and that ground led him to the cross. And maybe listen to what Hebrews says. So in Hebrews chapter 10, I think it says these words. Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Consider Jesus, and then let that shape your life.